Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. The title of this program is World Watchers. It's a 1-hour discussion of news. And as I've explained many times, and I forget sometimes, if you want a bibliography of information, the sources of where I obtain the material that I share with you on these broadcasts, send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Mae, M-A-E, Brussels, like Brussels sprouts, P.O. Box 22511, Carmel, California, 93922. Some of you have a pencil handy and take notes. Some forget to take notes or don't think of that in terms of listening to news analysis or broadcasts, but I suggest it, and better than that, send for the bibliography sheet, and that way you can collect them and then see what these broadcasts are about and what they add up to. I'm going back in time just for one moment to start the program over with a speech that Honorable Larry MacDonald gave in Congress regarding the murder of John Lennon. Right after he was murdered, Larry MacDonald from Georgia got up on the floor of Congress, and this is the speech that he gave commemorating the murder of John Lennon. You can obtain this is in the Congressional Record. The truth is that the Beatles waged a frighteningly successful war on the values of Western civilization. The Beatles represented rebellion against authority. They promoted release from restraints. Their music screamed out against order. They glorified reaction to and revolution against the moral standards and lifestyles of the Judeo-Christian culture. In his lifestyle, music, philosophy, and influence, John Lennon failed the test of value and usefulness. His death will soon be forgotten, but his life will continue to yield its unholy fruits because of the many people he helped to influence. Indeed, the tragedy of John Lennon was his life. I bring that up because of remarks that our cabinet appointee, the head of the Department of Education, made this week, and I'm going to refer to those in a few minutes. But he accuses Lennon of screaming out against order. And the order is the name of the group of people, the Aryan nations, the Nazis, the Silent Brotherhood, the group linked to the Waffen-SS in Germany and to Nazi networks all over the world. The few that are on trial up in Seattle, Washington, call themselves the Order. And the American Revolution was a rebellion against authority. But Larry MacDonald had a deep hatred, as did the people in the United States government that wanted to deport John Lennon, and this had been entered into the Congressional Record. Now, just this past week, Newsday, a friend from New York mailed me this story regarding Larry MacDonald and another subject which touches off a lot of sensitive nerves at this time, and that's the disease AIDS. The article says, former Governor Lester Maddox said yesterday the test of his blood showed no signs of exposure to the virus suspected of causing AIDS, even though the serum he got from a cancer clinic in the Bahamas may have been tainted with the virus of AIDS. Maddox, once a symbol of Southern segregation, was diagnosed as having prostate cancer in 1982. He told reporters at his Marietta home in Georgia that the former U.S. Representative Larry MacDonald, a urologist, recommended Dr. Lawrence Burton's Immunology Researching Center Limited in the Bahamas. MacDonald died in the Korean plane shot down by the Soviets in 1983. The Bahamian government shut down the center this summer after its serum was found to contain the virus that caused acquired immune deficiency syndrome. So Larry MacDonald, who had to stop medicine because of fraudulent medical practices that were under investigation and he should have been prosecuted and locked up for, and I have a lot more material on his medical practices that I haven't yet had time to put on the air. He's the one that was recommending that people go to this particular government agency in the Bahamas. It's not run by the government. It's a hospital in the Bahamas that the government shut down, but our Congressman, Larry MacDonald, had told Mr. Lester Maddox, the former governor of Georgia, to go to that particular clinic. Now, regarding AIDS, I want to do more on that, the Rajneesh, the Bhagwan group up in Oregon this evening and also later. But I don't want, in case I lose track and don't get to that this evening, I just want to mention that Thursday, September the 17th, the San Jose Mercury has an article, Suspected AIDS Victim Died at Guro's Commune. A suspected AIDS victim died Wednesday at the commune of Bhagwan Shrey Rajneesh, and explains Carl Gaskin, 43, of Dallas, Texas, who died of this AIDS. I think I mentioned before that they cremated him in a ceremony. They described it as a beautiful ceremony. But given the record of that group with their medicines, their plans to kill, their ability to put salmonella into food and poison, did they also have access to the AIDS virus similar to the one at the clinic in the Bahamas that a particular person could have? Now, Rock Hudson had surgery, bypass surgery, I think triple bypass, 3 years ago. And if you want to give somebody in Hollywood the disease and scare all of Hollywood, which is what is happening, and also wipe out a lot of artists of the theater, the stage, and screen, there wouldn't be a better way than to do it through this particular virus. And once they have surgery, if it has been isolated and there are people at that hospital that can give it, I'm wondering if it could be transferred to him and be in his body at that time. I bring that up because Jack Anderson has a story just this morning in the Monterey Herald, Swine Flu Virus Fears. That's the title of it. Doesn't tell you much in the title. But the gist of it is this. He said medical researchers suspect that the federal government has been discouraging tests that might identify a deadly swine virus as the cause of AIDS. The government, number one, is discouraging the test, and U.S. officials have discounted the fact that there's any connection between African swine flu and AIDS, but they won't let people have access to the material that they have. The second point in his article is that a Dr. John Beldakis of Boston University told reporters that it took 3 months to get swine fever material from the reluctant government department officials who were holding back, and the agriculture officials criticized the work of implying that there were these connections and that this material was secret. Then he went on to say that he was ordered not to talk to the press about the inability to get information to try and work on this disease for what were called national security interests. Now, what national security reasons would there be for the agricultural department to not pass this on? And they thought that was a fear that the pigs, the animal, would be passed through pork and so forth if it wasn't cooked well enough. But I think there's a much more political implication to this. Then Jack Anderson said Dr. TEAS theorized about the connection of the swine flu to not directly causing the disease, but getting certain viruses under uncooked meat and then spreading it through sexual contact to visiting Americans in Haiti, particularly, where two diseases, the swine flu and the AIDS, start out with similar symptoms of swollen lymph glands, and that's an important clue to another article I've had for a long time, and loss of appetite. Dr. Tees said that she was brushed off by the agricultural department officials and researchers because they didn't want a connection between the AIDS and the swine flu. She said when British researchers got positive results in the preliminary tests, they were discouraged from further experimentation by the agricultural department, and the agriculture department and the doors have been sort of blocked off to them. They treat you like you're crazy, complained Beldakis. That's not the way to do science. Human life is at stake. How well I know that, because the researchers who've done work into the political assassinations, John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and maybe 100 others, and the relationship of those things, we're always treated by various politicians, even the liberal Democrats, as if we're crazy, but in the scientific field, they're holding back because of the investigation. Incidentally, going back to November 1979, I have a story, man receives death sentence in murder by cancer case. And the prosecutor said this was the first murder by cancer. Well, I think Jack Ruby was a murder by cancer and Martha Mitchell, but this is the first that went to court. And they found that this person that was convicted, Stephen Roy Harper, put cancer-causing rocket fuel additive into drinks, into milk and lemonade, and that he contaminated them by dimethyl nitrosamine, an anti-corrosive rocket fuel additive that causes cancer in animals. Now, the lethal substance was taken from Epley Institute for Cancer Research, where the person who administered it was a lab assistant. This is from Omaha, Nebraska. Whatever Epley Institute for Cancer Research does, evidently you can't taste it. It's a rocket fuel, and it's given as a food, and this was the first conviction for a murder by cancer. Another story I have going back to 1977 regarding this disease, it has to do with a cancer experimentation project done by our Environmental Protection Agency, not much different than the Agriculture Department, the environmental, and it was done by, in a hospital de Gineco, Gineco Obstetrica, Mexico City. I mention the hospital because you may read about it in some other incidences that may come up. In 1975, the Environmental Protection Agency was using a hospital in Mexico, not in America. This is at the time of Watergate, and after that when Senator Frank Church was exposing these various mind control and medical experiments that were going on, so it was moved to Mexico. The taxpayers in the United States were putting up approximately $100,000, and the money had already been approved, and at the last moment, an attorney, Jeffrey Howard, caught on to what was happening in the situation. The Mexican officials approved, and the test was on thyroid, using the thyroid to give massive doses of cancer-causing fungicides to see what effect it would have on the human thyroid. So the thyroid comes into that, and also in the other article on the Agriculture Department, the diseases affect the swollen lymph glands, and those two are related. So the U.S. pharmaceutical firms, the large major pharmaceutical firms, were using these people for testing, and they were giving them fungicides known chemically as EBDC to be fed to humans. So in Mexico, in 1976, American taxpayers were paying for food to be put into the bodies of humans for cancer so the pharmaceutical firms can work on it. These were fungicides, and the other was a form of rocket fuel, one out of a cancer clinic in Nebraska, the other one run in Mexico by the Environmental Protection Agency. There's a book out called A Higher Form of Killing. David Emery up north, KFJC, has done an hour on tape. He has a cassette on AIDS. If you want to order that, you can, or you can write to me, and I'll give you his address. I didn't bring it in with me this evening. He's done an hour on AIDS, and he called attention to this book, A Higher Form of Killing, The Secret Story of Chemical and Biological Warfare. It was published in 1982. And in this book, just at the conclusion, at the very last pages, they talk about the United States Army going back as early as 1962. 40 scientists were employed at the U.S. Army Biological Warfare Laboratory on full-time genetics research. Many others, they said, would appreciate the implications of genetics for their own work. The implications were made more specific 7 years later. 1962 is when they started it. But 7 years later, Department of Defense spokesman claimed that genetic engineering could solve one of the major disadvantages of biological warfare, in that they could limit their disease to what would occur naturally in another part of the world. They could have it within their hands. Within the next 5 to 10 years, it would probably be possible to make a new infective microorganism which could differ in certain important respects from any known disease-causing organisms. Most important of these is that it might be refractory to the immunological and therapeutic process upon which we depend to maintain our relative freedom from infectious disease. So what they were planning is going back approximately to the time period now where it's really surfacing or began to surface, was to have a disease that singled out certain people, because if you had a large disease or biological warfare, it would take the people away that you wanted to survive, but they could change it and affect the immunological and therapeutic processes by working around with an infective microorganism. This book also, Higher Form of Killing, talks about an explosion that took place in the Soviet Union, and then there was an outbreak of anthrax. In April 1979, there was an explosion at a military settlement, and then the wind blew on people in the villages, and they began to die at a tremendous rate. And Robert Moss, who was a columnist with the London Daily Telegraph, picked up this story and began the justification for a lot of biological research in the United States, which was going on already, as you know, for a long, long time. Robert Moss is the co-partner of Arnaud Borchgrave, the two ministers of propaganda, anti-Soviet propaganda, and Borchgrave is the editor of the Washington Times for Reverend Moon. So it was Moss who was picking up this material, and also it was published in Bild Zeitung. That is that magazine coming out of Germany, linked to General Walker and the far right and the Gestapo SS material that I've done in the last few weeks, and I'm going to update in the next week or so. But they studied the outbreak of the anthrax and what happened with the people who were touching the contaminated food. But as I've said, with the rocket fuel that was fed people in Nebraska and also the food that was being tested in Mexico, it seems to be a more concerted, positive effort to give cancer, not through the air, but could these explosions, such as took place in the Soviet Union, spread these diseases? And this book, The Higher Form of Killing, goes into that selective desire that the United States always had and worked on to single out certain people for diseases. I had studies of that in my files. I have them going way back to studying the blacks and the Indian and the Jew and the Mexican and the Oriental, and finding particular things that appeal to their kind of blood system that you could knock them out, and other people could take and ingest foods at supermarkets and they wouldn't die, but the one segment of the population would die. And this book refers to those studies. It says man's increasing understanding of the delicate mechanism which makes life possible may also solve the problem of how to design a weapon to kill an enemy. And in this case, it is the white fundamentalists in this country killing the minorities, or the similar in Europe, but particularly in this country. Their effort, the Pentagon, was to leave friendly troops unharmed. In particular, military scientists might rekindle their interest in ethnic weapons designed to affect only selected racial groups. An American military manual noted the possibility in 1975. It is possible to develop a so-called ethnic chemical weapon which would be designed to exploit naturally occurring differences and vulnerability among specific population groups. Thus, such a weapon would be capable of incapacitating or killing a selected enemy population to a significantly greater extent the population of friendly forces. Many of the naturally occurring differences are well known. The inability of the digestive systems of particular racial groups to cope with the food of other group, for example. The differences go further. In the United States, where most of the research is being conducted, it has been established that within the American Indian population, 95% of Cherokee Indians have type O blood. 85% of Blackfeet Indian have type A blood. It is reasonable to suppose that other similar differences occur among less advanced society, meaning Chicano and Black and the Jew. Certainly, during the Vietnam War, the so-called Advanced Projects Research Agency, an elite group of scientists working for the Pentagon, was employed to carry out blood tests on selected groups of Asians with a view to preparing a map portraying the geographic distribution of blood groups and other inherited blood characters. The Pentagon claimed the project was solely to establish the food requirements of the American and Allied troops. Now, the Aryan nations, I believe I had on the air last week, had charted off a map, or I read in one of the stories recently, charted off a map of the United States where the blacks and Chicanos, Indians, and Jews, those pockets of populations exist. And then they should move north to areas that are cleansed of these people, and see, these kinds of things can be put into the food. Now, going down to India, the Union Carbide factory explosion in Bhopal, India, there was a story in the Sacramento Bee just this last October. The poison gas leak from Union Carbide factory in Bhopal, India, that killed some 1,700 people may have permanently damaged the immune system in the 200,000 injured, a researcher says. Now, this is similar to the explosion in the Soviet Union that happened. Then following the explosion, you could say, well, being as there was this explosion, this many people got sick from this disease. Dr. Carroll, an immunologist at the University of Pittsburgh, was presenting a paper on her research at the American Chemical Society in Chicago. She was commissioned by the Indian government to study the effect of the leak of methyl isocanate, December 3rd, 1984, from the ruptured valve. And she made a study of these people and said the people that were injured from the leak may have long-term damage to their immune system and that would be one of the consequences of that particular leak. Now, another story in the Houston Post, July the 7th, 1985, sent to me by a friend who clips hundreds of articles every week and dates them for me from Houston. It says, firm says product was misused. The farmer blames Union Carbide for tainted watermelon crops in California, Kern County, in Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and California, and Utah, British Columbia. This particular part on the West Coast, farmers blame the carbide for tainted watermelons, and we've talked about that before, and aldicarb that was on these melons, and a farmer said that he had used this for growing cotton 4 years ago. The brand name was Temic. It was made by Union Carbide, and it was produced in India by the Bhopal factory, and it affected the food this summer. We had all kinds of poison foods, the broccoli and sprays on the lettuce, and particularly the melons, and they were singled out. This is one, and the cheese, food, and milk, problems with the milk. Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and California, Utah, and British Columbia have had this problem with the melons, and I wonder if there was any chemical similar to the ones that this man was charged for from the lab in Nebraska included in this that would affect the body later and the immune system if the same chemical in India was changing the immune system there. Now, there's a new book out I haven't seen on the stand yet. It's called Flowering of the Bamboo, and there's an article about it in the Washington Post early this year, and it has to do again with America and chemicals and how far back our interest goes. The article is titled Japan's Oldest Death Row Inmate May Be Innocent. The title is so misleading that many of you might have missed this, and I didn't see it anywhere else but the Washington Post. This is from Tokyo. The U.S. government has now released new documents, imagine this is 1985, from 40 years ago, that have to do with a celebrated resident on Japan's death row, Mr. Sadamichi Hirasawa, who's been waiting execution for 30 years because of a conviction in 1948 of a mass murder at a Tokyo bank. The papers support his family's assertion that the murders were probably committed by veterans of a secret chemical and germ warfare unit of the disbanded Japanese Imperial Army. Now, this is the unit that the Charles Willoughby, I think he was a general, we'll call him a general, I want to say colonel, but Charles Willoughby, the chief of all intelligence for General Douglas MacArthur, who was one of the founders with Ronald Reagan of Young Americans for Freedom with William Buckley. Willoughby was the commanding officer who said, don't prosecute these people, we will use their experiments for the future. And what happened is he was there with those experiments when they learned about them when the war was over, and probably using them while the war was going on, was that America would use their expertise and therefore nobody should be prosecuted. Now, getting back to this case, they say that the chemicals, the secret chemical and germ warfare, was used by the Japanese Imperial Army. The papers have detailed the role of the murder investigation by the United States Military Occupation Headquarters in post-war Japan, and were submitted recently to a Tokyo court to support a petition for a new trial for Mr. Hirasawa, who's now 93 years old, the oldest resident on Japan's death row. He would be 1 year younger than Hitler if Hitler is alive. After the war, the United States granted members of the Japanese unit immunity from war crimes. That was Charles Willoughby, Mr. Karl Wiedenbach, it was his real name, immunity from war crimes prosecution in return for data from their experiments. This did not become generally known in Japan until the 1970s when the newspapers here wrote extensively on the subject. Hirasawa supporters have contended that the Americans, fearful of exposure of the unit's operations and their decision not to prosecute, have ordered the Japanese police to stop the investigation of the unit. But the documents didn't assert that in that much. They weren't spelled out in those words, but those were the beliefs of the people supporting Mr. Hirasawa, that it was suppressed because they didn't want the Americans to know how much we used the experiments. Hirasawa, now in failing health, was convicted of the Imperial Bank incident January 26, 1948. On that afternoon, a man posing as a Japanese health inspector went to the Tokyo branch of the bank and told the 16 employees to drink this particular poison by telling them it was a medicine that was preventing an epidemic and that they were to take it. The man fled with money from the safe. The employees lay writhing on the floor, and 12 died. Hirasawa was arrested 6 months later, and a forced confession came, citing police coercion at the time. He was convicted and sentenced to death. In 1955, the Japanese Supreme Court upheld the conviction, and he entered death row. The execution never took place. Outside the prison, a support group has been campaigning for decades for his freedom. One of the first and key contention is that prosecutors never explained how Hirasawa, a professional artist, obtained poison and was so well versed in its dosage and effects and the psychology of inducing people to drink it. The U.S. documents were obtained by writer William Triplett, Triplett. His book about the bank crime and the investigation is called Flowering of the Bamboo. It's supposed to be released this fall. It should be coming out now by Woodbine House, a Washington publisher. Two documents detail a Tokyo meeting attended by the U.S. Japanese officials and the chief Japanese detective in the case. According to the documents, Fujita told the group that the best police leads were people who had been linked to a secret Japanese Army chemical laboratory, which was used by the United States, where experiments were perfected in the use of prussic acid, the poison used at the bank robbery, Imperial Bank robbery. Techniques for using the poison were published in Army pamphlets, and the robber used the identical method. This is what they tried to say he used. They were in the Army manuals. And so this poor guy, 93, he's still in jail, but our use of chemicals as a weapon continued after the war. If America didn't use it before, we brought the expertise of Joseph Mengele and the Japanese Army and the scientists right into our Air Force, into Fort Derrick, Maryland, and began the research. So, therefore, the secrecy and the title national security that Jack Anderson speaks about today has to do with the same national security that got this fellow locked up, and because the Army and the Japanese Army worked together on these medical experiments. Now, the Interpol, International Police, are having their annual meeting, and Attorney General EDWIN MEESE is going to lend the prestige of his office to this particular meeting. This is a San Francisco Examiner article on EDWIN MEESE planning a meeting with the international crime experts. Attorney General EDWIN MEESE will lend his prestige of office, whatever prestige MEESE has, today in the opening meeting of the International Criminal Police Organization known as Interpol. It was once boycotted by the United States because some of the leaders have been former Nazis. That's a total lie. It wasn't boycotted by the United States at all. 500 Interpol officers, experts from 100 countries, are going to be working. MEESE described Interpol as a worldwide association of police forces created in 1923 to promote mutual assistance in detecting and suppressing international crime. EDWIN MEESE might know for his speech when he speaks there. It was formed by Adolf Hitler in Vienna in 1923, and the Gestapo was formed just at that time. The United States National Central Bureau, which communicates with Interpol, comes under the jurisdiction of the Justice Department, and the president of Interpol this past year has been Secret Service Chief John Simpson, first United States president elected at the Interpol meeting. Asked specifically about Paul Dickopf, a former Nazi SS officer with Interpol, Mr. Simpson said there are many people who, unfortunately, for one reason or another, were involved in various parts of the Nazi military apparatus and police apparatus during that period of time, maybe for their own self-interest, I'm not sure. When asked about Nazi SS Reinhard Heydrich, who also was president of Interpol from 1940 until his assassination in 1942, he was succeeded by Ernest Kaltenbrunner, chief of the Nazi security police, who was executed as a war criminal. Interpol has 136 member countries. Also, after the war was over, Mr. Dickopf of the Waffen-SS was the head of the Interpol. The United States has been part of it, and J. Edgar Hoover got as appointment as director of the FBI was put in by Herbert Hoover, and he was vice president of Interpol and worked with all the Nazis until they began to invade Poland, or until after Pearl Harbor, when it wasn't right for American head of the Justice Department investigation branch, the FBI, to be that close to the Nazis. So there was about a 3-year lapse until 1945 when we picked up again with them. They don't find former Nazis. They don't find the drug traffickers. In fact, they hardly find anybody. Interpol is international police. It's exactly what it means. We'll take a 1-minute break now, and then I'll come back to some other current news items that relate to past events also. This is Mae Brussell, and this is part 2 of broadcast number 722, the program World Watchers. And as I explained at the beginning of the program, in case you missed it, if you want to send for information on the source of these articles that I use on this program, the sheet, the bibliography sheet, you can write to Mae Brussell, P.O. Box 22511, Carmel, California, 93922. Send a self-addressed stamped envelope. I'm not answering mail that doesn't have an envelope included. It just takes too much time. Education Secretary William J. Bennett said this past week that the Americans should push for public schools to teach civic and moral duties, that American children should know that they are morally superior to the Soviet Union. He prepared this speech for the Eagle Forum, their leadership conference. It's part of the New Right education lobby founded by conservative activist Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly and her husband are on the board of Technicolor, and they work closely with Patrick Frawley, the gentleman who conceived the idea to put Ronald Reagan into office and got the kitchen cabinet connected together. He also brought over Mr. Fred Schwartz for the World Anti-Communist Group. There was a convention in Dallas several weeks ago, the World Anti-Communist League, and Phyllis Schlafly and her sister are very active there. Her sister had an organization front, and they keep pushing for the morality while they have their headquarters and activities, many of them in Taiwan, the headquarters of organized crime, the Asian mobs, the heroin and cocaine traffic, and the drug traffic from Southeast Asia, part of the Kuomintang and the Laotian tribesmen that work with our intelligence community, and they push this moral thing that we're morally superior to a country that doesn't deal or sell narcotics that is affecting our entire world. The moral vision that Mr. Bennett has is one against the Soviet Union. And as I say, he wants, as a professor, head of the education department, to teach the moral difference between the United States and the Soviet Union. He might look up in March 1977, March 18th, there was an arrest in Dallas, Texas, of General Walker, resigned Army Major General Edwin A. Walker, a former lecturer of the John Birch Society, a friend of all the people behind Mr. Bennett, who was arrested for a second time because there were charges of fondling plainclothes officers in park restroom. That was the second time he'd been arrested on a charge of homosexual advances in lavatories to gentlemen, not children, but gentlemen in Dallas, Texas. And this had been a second arrest for public lewdness. That is General Walker. There's nothing that these people comment upon, those kinds of associations or the relationships. Even when Ronald Reagan was governor, there was a homosexual circle in the Capitol building exposed right in the middle and around him. But those parts these people don't refer to, and they always have this cloak that we're morally superior to the Soviets. That's the main target. Among their crowd that they're so loyal to is Paul Laxalt. He's been involved with a lot of allegations coming out of a particular newspaper, the McClatchy newspaper, out of Sacramento, the Sacramento Bee, the Modesto Bee in Fresno. They ran stories of his links to a place in Nevada, Ormsby House Casino in Carson City, Nevada, and claimed that skimming money from the gambling tables, the losses of these poor dogs that go up there and bet away their money, was going to Laxalt and his family between 1972 and 1976. So Laxalt is the right-hand man of the current president of the United States. He was pushed to be president someday by the Howard Hughes organization. And Laxalt is no virgin, being the governor of Nevada and representing them as a senator. You know what goes on there. There's one article out of the Sacramento Bee listed 57 people who want to help Paul Laxalt in his suit. And I just bring this up because of Mr. Bennett's morality and how moral we are. Some of the defendants included Irwin Molaski of Las Vegas, a television producer, and executive Merv Adelson of Los Angeles, co-owners of La Costa with Mo Dalitz. Dalitz law enforcement officials have identified as being a top organized crime figure. This is published in the newspaper identifying Dalitz as that. Dalitz lived in Las Vegas and was close to Robert Mailloux when Mailloux set up the assassination teams with John Rosselli and Sam Giancana, who played a role in the murder of John Kennedy. And Jack Ruby is close to that gang in Vegas, the people that were also going to have a fringe part in the murder of the President of the United States. That's morality in America. They also produced these people mentioned here, Mr. Adelson and Mr. Molaski, produced the television movie Dallas. And you remember on the 20th anniversary of when John Kennedy was murdered, the big thing was who shot JR, who shot JR. And the diversion went, in Dallas, who shot? And there was this double entente about the murder of John Kennedy. Well, Mo Dalitz's partners from La Costa produce the television series Dallas, in case you wonder if the world is coincidences or not, and I don't believe half of it is. Among the contributors to Paul Axel's funds, they mentioned Donald Trump, the owner of the United States Football League in New Jersey, the New Jersey Generals in Atlantic City Casino, and his father, Fred Trump. The attorney for them is Roy Cohn, who is on the board of Western Goals and who's been named in the Torvald document and his role in his corporation, the Lionel Corporation, that he represented in the role of murdering John Kennedy. Roy Cohn is listed in the Sacramento Bee as being one of the people contributing to Paul Laxalt, and Henry Salvatore and Holmes Tuttle. Those are two of the early kitchen cabinets behind the career of Ronald Reagan, and Joseph Coeur, the financier of the far, far right, and the morality, the moral people, the Schlaflys and the Mr. Bennett and the organizations of the far right. They are pushing for the governor of Nevada, of all places. Speaking of the double-barreled edge of the drug dealing, the sadomasochism of Mr. Alfred Bloomingdale, and he's not the only one. The whole administration is mafia. It's Vatican connected to the worst elements, not those bishops that are crying about poverty in America, but the worst elements. And one of the people that put up money for Paul Laxalt for his defense is Roger Milliken, who was on the board of Western Goals with Edward Teller, the hydrogen bomb, the Star Wars daddy, and partner of J. Peter Grace, the one who brought Otto Ambrose and the scientists from Auschwitz, the fatal chemicals, gases that they manufactured by Mr. Ambrose, the chemist, partner, and brought here by Milliken and Grace. They're putting up money for Paul Laxalt's defense. And Ivan Boesky, a New York arbitrator, and Ivan Boesky's on the board of the Wiesenthal Center. This is a nice group of very moral people who are representing a man who has worked with the hardest mafia, mob, sinister people that can rule the world, and they are the backbone of the Ronald Reagan administration. The Howard Hughes organization was the one that handpicked Paul Laxalt to have a major part in the government of the United States and also hopefully to be president someday. Now, if we're so moral, why are we building this $5 billion protection plan for the United States embassies? If we're so hated, why don't we go home? The New York Times has this story, September 29th. The State Department has proposed a 5-year, $5 billion program to overhaul the security of our embassies and to counter Soviet bloc espionage overseas. Now, the proposal was made by Admiral Bobby Inman. He was the head of the National Security Agency. He was deputy director of the CIA. He's one of the most dangerous men in America with his multi-computer in Texas. And they're keeping track of every person or everything that you need to know about citizens around the world. And it's his idea to put this in. What I think it is in quotes, to protect our embassies, and therefore our people won't be hurt. I think we allowed some to be hurt, just as the CIA manual says, kill some of your own for particular political purposes and provocative acts. And then it would be a spy agency in every country that would allow us to continue spying on liberals, on newspaper publishers, and keeping tracks of people around the world. And you could turn them into Interpol. This $5 billion for agencies is absolutely ridiculous. They're already built, and if they don't like us, they could do half their work by telephone and get home. But it gives you a spying system in every country under the justification of we're being attacked. Another ridiculous amount of money was proposed in July of this year in front of the White House. A House subcommittee voted Thursday to give the east front of the Capitol building $8.4 million security facelift to protect it against terrorists. They want to take away 326 spaces for cars to be parked. Among the security features of the plans are two 30-inch curved steel blades that are raised hydraulically from their hiding place in the ground at the main north and south entrances to the Capitol. We're becoming like an armed camp. There's a warfare going on, and it's going to escalate when you get steel blades in front of the White House and billions of dollars, not 50, $5 million in front of the White House, 8.4 million plaza, rather, and you get this huge amount for the overseas embassies. That's the $5 billion plan. It's horrendous because we're thinking in terms of how can we secure ourselves from the enemy, not what are we doing wrong that they dislike us. It would cost about $100 to sit down and figure out what we're doing wrong. If you were walking along the newsstands of the grocery markets, liquor stores, and magazine stands, you probably saw the National Enquirer and the Star and all the papers, the story of Miss America. We finally got a Miss America. You got a black woman who was naked, so you had to take her crown away. But now you got a white woman from Mississippi. And the story goes on that Susan Akin, A-K-I-N, her father and her grandfather were arrested in cold-blooded murders of 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964. Their murders were planned and the gasoline cars were filled up at her father's mobile home park. The grandfather couldn't go along with him because the FBI said that an officer of the Klan never gets blood on their hands. This is similar to the American hit machines when you hire the Giaconas and the Rossellis to do the murders, and Mayhew's hands don't drip, and Richard Nixon's, but on down the lowers do it. It's the same system. So on that night, the team went out, shot 3 men, buried him, dug up the car. Grandpa got off. Daddy was indicted. He got off. The jury said he was okay. I believe that they knew this all along, and she knew it, and I believe they waited until she got the crown and then said, oh, yeah, and made the Klan respectable. In other words, this wasn't supposed to be a smear like Miss Williams being seen naked. This was supposed to be, we're all American, and she's a Klan, and her daddy and granddaddy's killed 3 civil rights leaders, and that's what we are. Here we are, and I think they're proud of it, and I think it's a precedent. You don't take a crown away because they were the Klan, but they went to every length to make sure there were no more scandals involved with these particular people, and the powers that be all knew this background, and we're proud to have her as Miss America, build her up for it, to show that you can be a Klan and be beautiful and talented, and that this is just part of the way of life of living in America. Now I want to talk about a process known as the elections in this country and some very serious things that are taking place. First is an article in Los Angeles Times, May 13th, let's get rid of the 3rd-term ban. Now, the President of the United States was asked recently at Camp David, somewhere near there, about he's too old now to have a 3rd term, but should they have it? And he said yes, which is tantamount to having a dictatorship. At once he wanted a 6-year term with no re-election, rewriting the Constitution. The first draft to rewrite it that was done in Santa Barbara was a 6-year term with no re-election. Now they say let him go on forever, so that what you have is a Mr. Pinochet, or you have, like in Taiwan, the Chang family, and then it goes on to the son, and the Shah of Iran's son is ready to return. You really have a monarchy, and they want a 3rd term. But who wants it? The article is written by Frank Mankiewicz, described as executive vice president of Gray & Company, a Washington public relations firm. Mankiewicz was a Democrat who was supposed to be a friend of John F. Kennedy, who, when his head was blown up, like all the others, shut his mouth, went to the staunch conservatives and the Central Intelligence Agency group, people centering around him, and Larry O'Brien and Tom Braden's wife works for them, for Gray, and it's a real fascist CIA organization. It was a takeover from the Mullen Incorporated that was exposed at the time of Watergate. So Mankiewicz, the former Democrat, whatever he calls himself, just as Gene Kirkpatrick was a Democrat, wants a 3rd term, and he works for Gray, and this is his opinion of the way the Constitution, I suppose, if you have a convention to get a budget that isn't going to go up to $3 trillion, then at that time you make possible that Kissinger be elected. He's very, very close to Robert Keith Gray. He was his boss over Task Force 157, and then you get a president that's in forever, and that could be even Kissinger, who'd stay on forever. Another article about the electoral process was San Francisco Chronicle this past week, September 25th, probe of election computers by National Security Agency. Now, this is one of my pet peeves, and this is why it's so important to take note of this particular article and subject. I think we should go back to hand voting by hand, one by one. This country is gone. There never will be an election the way the voting process and machines are going. And if you don't know that, then go through the exercise, but you're kidding yourself. This article says a branch of the National Security Agency, that's the same group that Bobby Inman used to be the head of, is investigating whether a computer program that counted more than one-third of the nation's votes in 1984 is vulnerable to fraudulent manipulation. Well, you bet it is. The target of the agency's investigation is the vote counting program of Computer Election Systems of Berkeley, California, the dominant company in the manufacture and sale of computer voting apparatus. In 1984, the company's program and related equipment were used in more than 1,000 county and local jurisdictions to collect 34 million votes of the 93 million in the United States. The National Security Agency is the world's largest and most secretive intelligence agency that collects information and eavesdropping on electronic communications around the world. This is the agency that Bobby Inman headed, who wants that $5 billion for the embassies around the world, $5 billion safety, and they'd use their computers. That would be their safety, to know who's a threat to particular countries. Now, the idea for the National Security Agency to investigate the voting machines was put into power by Ronald Reagan September 17, 1984. The National Security Agency's Computer Security Center was set up 3 years ago to improve the security of computers and give a broader mandate was taken to go into the electoral process. They were supposed to check military service, but now they've done more. Representative Dan Glickman, he's from Kansas, told the House Science and Technology Subcommittee that held hearings on the role of the Computer Security Center that he has serious reservations about the Defense Department agency, the Defense Department, being the center and being involved in the computer system that handles sensitive civilian matters like elections. Some of you may want to write, and I'm going to Dan Glickman. He's from Kansas, a Democrat from Kansas, and they're having hearings now. The computer system, he said, used by the counties to collect and process votes has nothing to do with national security. And I'm really concerned about the National Security Agency involvement, said Glickman. Now, national security was the excuse that Jack Anderson just cited for scientists not being able to see information on AIDS. And national security make our nation secure because you don't know and Congress doesn't know what it needs. And remember what the National Security Agency said when they were going to fund the Contras, when Congress said the CIA shouldn't do it. They said, Congress doesn't know what's going on. We know. We're the National Security Agency. Now, the investigation began because of lawsuits in Indiana, West Virginia, Maryland, and Florida that have challenged the election results processed by their computers, and I really believe that we should go into that hand-punching. Once the National Security Agency goes into the computer system and makes it a matter of defense, and in quotes, national security, you're really in trouble. Now, as far as elections go, George Bush came out just this week. Bush defends fundamentalists in politics. He received an honorary degree at the Episcopal Church's University of the South in Tennessee, and he defended attempts by fundamentalist Christians to influence American politics. He cited the American Revolution in the 18th century and how the church influenced reforms in education, prison, mental hospitals, child labor laws in the past 2 centuries. He doesn't say how the church has influenced reforms in El Salvador, Guatemala, Philippines, South Korea, Taiwan, or Iran when we had the Shah. They're the countries that we've put into power. And all those Christians and Catholics and trained in the United States, how Christianity affected those people, how you go into Chile And how does Mr. Pinochet's Christianity affect prison, mental health, education, and child labor? And he defends it that a Christian minister can become president. Jesse Jackson wants to be a president, and he said, why, if he runs for president, why shouldn't a minister? Well, Mr. Pat Robertson, as you know, wants to run for president, and his $22 million Christian broadcasting network has been funding the Contras, has been funding death squads, works with the Somoza Army, is against land reform. Pat Robertson, the roommate of J. Peter Grace at Yale, has associations to the entire Grace operation. And, of course, Grace and his friend and partner Roger Millikan are the people that brought Otto Ambros to this country, the chemist for Adolf Hitler who designed Zyklon B for extermination. Extermination by AIDS or extermination by Zyklon B, there's no difference. If the government and the Defense Department are in a chemical war against people and genocides against particular people, the Japanese Army experiments that I cited earlier are directly linked to these people running for office as presidential nominees, to George Bush's relationship to fascism, to Pat Robertson's relationship to fascism. They're into biological warfare, they're into genocide, and that's the difference. I think Jesse Jackson wants a fair shake for a lot of people, and I don't think at this point, or if ever, he is against jobs or housing or prison programs and so forth. Now, getting back, or continuing with the elections and getting back to Mr. Farrakhan, who I have cited as being brought in and funded to break up the Democratic Party, to split the blacks against Mr. Mondale in the last elections. If that was bad, you ain't seen nothing yet. Wait till the next elections. The Democrats don't have a chance. No matter if Bush wants Pat Robertson as vice president, he's got him. If he wants Falwell, he's got him. There's no Democratic Party. None of the Democrats had anybody. The National Security Agency runs the computers for the electoral process. It's all over. You can just study it academically, like you take a corpse and you do an autopsy. Some people say, why do you continue this work? Well, I'm doing an autopsy now, but the electoral process is for all purposes over. Now, there's a story in the LA Times, 2 stories the same day, and interestingly enough, I don't even know if the people who wrote them consult with each other. One is white nationalist leader said he had contacts with Farrakhan. This is by Judith Cummings, saying October the 2nd, printed in the New York Times October the 3rd, but cited the day of the 2nd. The former head of the Ku Klux Klan in California headed a white nationalist delegation that went to see Louis Farrakhan in Los Angeles. The former Klan leader, Thomas Metzger of San Diego, said he and members of his organization were invited by Farrakhan and that he contributed $100 to Farrakhan's cause. I'm sure there was a lot more. Metzger is now the head of the White People's Political Association, a white nationalist organization. And it tells about his close simpatico relationships with Mr. Farrakhan. That's Mr. Metzger of the Nazi Party. Now, the same day, in the same newspaper, by Wayne King, is a story, Nazis share their gains from crime with groups. And last week I mentioned some of the people who are recipients of the money of the Ukiah Bank robbery and another robbery. They're not charged. The people who got the money aren't even charged with the crime. The men who broke the bank are being charged, but the people whose pockets it's in, like Richard Butler of Aryan Nations, and I mentioned members of the Klan and how they bought computers with their money. Well, the New York Times has a story. It's October the 3rd. It was printed. The recipients of the money included 2 interesting people in particular. $250,000 went to a former California Klansman, Thomas Metzger, and $50,000 went to William Pierce in Washington, D.C., and $40,000 to Richard Butler. Now, Butler is a scientist from Lockheed who worked on the U-2 project with Thane Caesar. Thane Caesar is the man who killed Robert Kennedy. William Pierce took over the Nazi Party from Mr. Rockwell, and he got a hunk of this money, $50,000, and writes the Turner Diary on how to kill all Jews and blacks. And Mr. Metzger was the recipient also of money, $250,000 from the bank robbery, and that's the Mr. Metzger that's at the meeting at the invitation of Mr. Farrakhan in Los Angeles. Now, to fit in with Mr. Farrakhan getting money from the National Nazi Klan organization that gets their money, some of it through, well, we know there's secret money under the table, but some just from overt bank robberies. Other money is coming to Mr. Gaddafi, who also handed Mr. Farrakhan interest-free the allegation, it's $5 million for sure, and there's been some articles up to $30 million. This is a story from the Wall Street Journal on Gaddafi building a bridge. It's called a Great Man-Made River, a gap between water sources and the dry desert around Gaddafi. He has an ambitious project to bring gallons of water from wells under the Sahara Desert 350 miles to the Mediterranean coast, where the water will be piped up and down the coastline to make a barren land bloom with crops and to quench the thirst of Libya's metropolitan area. Now that is great. I'm not fighting that, and that's what Israel did. And they want to bring in from the Sahara, under the Sahara, which always had a green belt. Under Nigeria, there always was a group where Frenchmen were growing things and the black were dying and starving from the drought. This water would be brought up. The cost of the project is going to be $25 billion. The first stage of work will be done by South Korea, but the man behind the planning of it and helping the manager of this project for Gaddafi is, according to the Wall Street Journal, is the Houston-based construction giant Brown and Root. Another American firm, Price Brothers of Dayton, Ohio, will help them, a subsidiary of Halliburton. Now, Brown and Root is the organization that hired George DeMohrenschildt. He worked for them, and they were very much part of the CIA, the Defense Department. They had most of the cement contracts for Vietnam War and have built all over the world. Brown and Root is directly involved with the intelligence community. George DeMohrenschildt received his money from Brown and Root, a lot of it, and he was the mentor of Lee Harvey Oswald. It was the activity of DeMohrenschildt and Brown and Root and Paula Salt's gang also, all combined, and Roy Cohn's, that overthrew this country and put it in the sense of a coup in 1963 when John Kennedy was killed. So it is natural that Brown and Root would be funding Gaddafi, and then some of that money may not go to the water. It may go from Gaddafi to Farrakhan, who's working with the Nazis, because I mentioned before that John Connally from Permindex, who worked with Roy Cohn, and get all these circles coming together, Cohn with Laxalt helping with his defense. Permindex had John Connally, and John Connally is directly linked to Richard Butler and the Aryan nations in the Nazi clan network, of which Mr. Metzger is a part of. He gets bank robbery money that goes in his pocket. He's visiting Farrakhan. Connally's name is on tapes involving the Klan and the Nazis that were to take over Dominica, the island of Dominica, and they're involved with the Klan and Nazis and Aryan Nation up in Idaho. So the same people that overthrew this country in 1963 are wiping out the Democratic Party by splitting its guts wide open ever since. People like Mankiewicz worked for Gray and Tom Braden and Larry O'Brien for the Hughes organization. The party was sucked up, bought out, sold out, slivered up to pieces, and that is the end of the Democratic Party. And in fact, John Connally was a Democrat until Nixon came in. Democrats for Nixon, like Gene Kirkpatrick. There's a story in Executive Intelligence Review of the connections of Richard Butler to Gaddafi. This is titled Libyan Interface with U.S. Neo-Nazis, making it not only Farrakhan, that cycle of Farrakhan and Metzger and Brown and Root to Libya, but Libya to Richard Butler, and you get a whole cycle. As we keep saying, David Emery and I, what goes around comes around. This says the Islamic fundamentalist Al-Mahala recently ran pictures of Richard Butler of the Aryan Nation and robed members of the Ku Klux Klan, those are the Metzger gang, with an accompanying caption, American Friendly Fortress. A short article reported on the philosophy of these groups and noted that the Aryan nations and the Klan concurred in Islamic fundamentalism. And remember, Gaddafi was trained as a young person, still just very young and in the army, by Mr. Otto Skorzeny, who was training with the top Nazis for South Africa and the Middle East when the war was over. This article is a short article report on the philosophy of these groups and noted the Aryan nations and the Klan concurred with Islamic fundamentalism and that the Israelis are occupying Palestine. Sources say that Richard Butler's organization is receiving Libyan money, and as well as the bank robbery money, and that there is an interface between the Iranians and the white supremacist survivalist network in the United States. On the left side of the Libyan operation is the EAFORD, EAFORD, the International Organization for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, founded in Tripoli in 1979. It's a network of anthropologists, scientists, and left-wing organizations working with Gaddafi. Abdallah Sharafeddin, a Libyan nationalist who is the international president, lives in Houston, Texas. According to intelligence sources, EAFORD is an above-ground umbrella operation that works with the Libyan terrorist operations in Houston, Texas, in Dallas, in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, Toronto, and Montreal. They have a network of activities that support Minister Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam. They sponsor speaking engagements. Farrakhan is said to have received $30 million from his trip to Libya. On the surface, it was $5 million. And he's going to buy land in southern United States for an independent black nation. Well, the time is running out, but the electoral process, I bring that up because it was divided at the last election. Democrats didn't have a chance anyway, and I don't, as I say, don't think the computers work. But it's over. All you can do is just study the pieces. Well, I have a lot more to share with you, a lot more, of course, but we can't stretch that hour. Unfortunately, that's a tight gap. That limit is, those 60 minutes can't be stretched. That's not fair. So we got to stop now. But I'll continue with this and a lot more that relates to it next week. Thank you for sending me so many articles. I'm getting some wonderful material from all around the country. I really appreciate that. Again, I want to thank you. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you next week.